So let's just take the template where smart people have already figured it out, copy paste
Give it to dumb people.
to RGB, and we're done. Whenever we ask them about it, they say, well, it costs a lot to license. And it's like, license what? Why can't you read a bus address, you send a command, and you get a number back? Does that really rise to the level of intellectual property licensing? Come on.
These devices have become a problem, and we're creating an open standards organization to steward better product compatibility and long-term support, and we're doing it with this guy. No. No, we can't do those noises in the video. Absolutely not. There's a problem brewing in the PC industry, and it's that none of this works with anything else. But we're genuinely concerned that although this is manifesting as a future RGB illuminated dystopian hellscape of vendor lockouts and future hardware abandonment, probably leading to e-waste, it may also spread like shambling zombie rainbows to infect other aspects of consumer electronics in a way that restricts and ultimately kills choice and innovation. This is of particular concern for smaller companies. So we needed to talk to someone about not just the problem, but the solution. And we needed someone with a positive, upbeat outlook.
Start with the RGB controller, because that is literally the dumbest thing. Like, is that the hill that Corsair really wants to die on?
Well, sullen and angry also works here. But when we reached out to Wendell during Computex, we asked if he'd join us to rant about this problem. He said,
listen, we're gonna start a new organization.
Oh yeah, Wendell pitched this idea to me 6 hours ago.
Yeah.
And I'm on board. And that's why we're announcing OpenPleb, a joint effort combining some of GN's resources and reach and some of Level 1 Techs resources and knowledge to create a stewardship organization for maintaining documentation and pledges to try and unfuck the current cluster that is hardware. This isn't a new standard, to be very clear, but rather something more similar to Open Compute's collection of documentation and agreements between vendors. But as exciting as that is, Wendell was still happy to fulfill our initial request of just ranting.
I've got this peripheral, it works great, and then the software gets kind of janky, and then the software gets very janky, and then the software doesn't work anymore.
We filmed this in a quiet cafe in Taipei City after Computex, so it's an easygoing discussion where we were trying to draw not too much attention, unlike Gordon the other day.
You know, F you, NVIDIA. You know, what's up with the prices?
Hey, Gordon.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're in a restaurant. Let's get into the conversation with Wendell and talk about not just the problem, but the solution that we're both excited to announce. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut and Cryonaut thermal pastes are high-performing thermal interfaces for use on CPUs and GPUs. You can bring an old card back to peak performance by repasting it and doing preventative maintenance, and Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut is ideal for water cooling and air cooling for new and old cards alike. Cryonaut paste is one of the top-performing pastes for extreme overclocking with CPUs and GPUs, and has been used in several world record-scoring machines. Learn more at the link in the description below.
Too much.
I'm very intimidated. I'm kind of angry, but we're in a very quiet place. So I've brought my anger translator, Wendell, from Level 1 Techs.
Don't provoke the Steve.
He's gonna help back me down from the anger over proprietary standards in the computer hardware industry.
Why does everybody need an RGB connector that's different? Why? Why is this a thing?
And sensors. Special sensors that not everyone can read.
And that kind of thing on the motherboard. Like, it doesn't need to be this way. There needs to be a solution.
And so we have today, not just the complaint. I messaged Wendell and I said, I really want to complain about all the different RGB bullshit and also all of the sensor problems and how nothing is standardized right now. And I think it's unhealthy for the industry, for consumers. And I just want to complain on camera. And Wendell said, what if...
Me too.
And then you said, what if we also tried to have a solution?
Yeah.
So that's where we're combining forces, and we have some ideas for a potential open standards organization, and Wendell brought that into the show today, so we'll be talking about that, but we also just want to set the stage and why is this a problem that Corsair, Height, Lianli all have a different approach to their cabling nightmare, moving away from the shitty RGB standard to a better proprietary solution.
Remember when it was just, you get a color header and it was an RGB, like a literal analog value, and then somehow one digital pin, one single digital pin for digital RGBs, and we end up in a situation where we have 5 competing standards.
Yes.
It's like the meme where it's like, oh, we're going to make one standard, unify all the standards, and then there was one more competing standard.
The XKCD comic.
Yeah.
Where it was, they had 12 and then they had 13.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that. And every year at every show, it's worse. And it's up to you to vote with your wallet. There's not a lot of good things for consumers happening here. I've certainly experienced it, probably you have too, in terms of, I've got this peripheral, it works great, and then the software gets kind of janky, and then the software gets very janky, and then the software doesn't work anymore.
And then it gets no more support.
Yeah. Power supplies even.
Yes. I have a specific gripe. I brought this up with Corsair when we were at their booth, and they said, we have this new really cool IQ Link. Here's what it does. And I said, cool. Does it support the AX1600i that you abandoned? And they were like, what do you mean? And I said, it has Link. And then they went on to explain Link. And I was like, no, not that Link. The Link that was discontinued 2 years after the $400 power supply came out.
Yeah.
And I can no longer set my multi-rail OCP to single rail, so it's useless for a lot of my stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of thing in the industry, and I was surprised. Power supply. Certainly, we've encountered it with RGB peripherals. We've encountered it with software-controlled RAM, where you control the RGB in your RAMs from the first generation DDR4. It's just, how do you control it? And it's like, well, they hadn't figured out stuff then, so it was a little problematic for support.
Yeah, and that's what you mentioned, that there's specifically a memory kit that the SPD would get wiped.
Yeah.
And so this is the kind of thing that's a problem where it's like, from a consumer perspective, the issues I have with what Corsair, Height, and Lianli are doing, and all of them have done a much better job at building something that at least accommodates their hardware for today, for whatever, RGB light shows and all of this other stuff, daisy chaining things. So for example, Height and Corsair both allowing you to connect LED strip to fan to hub or whatever. And that's
good
cool.
ideas.
Yeah.
But
none of it works with anything else. And my concern is that, as I've been in the industry long enough now, finally, where you see this stuff break and then you're just screwed. And the solution is you buy more stuff from that vendor, and you end up getting locked into an ecosystem. And I think that's not only bad for the consumer, because now you're stuck with this one company that may not maintain the same standards they had when you first bought in, but also it limits growth within the enthusiast segment.
yeah, and I think as we were kind of discussing it, I think we both sort of recognized that it's not reasonable to ask Corsair to support the AX1600 for this long. So that's what, like 5-7-year-old power supply?
Yeah, it's like ancient. Their warranty's only 10 years.
Ooh.
This restricts growth for new companies, where now if you have a smaller company that's innovative, or even one that's been around a while like Scythe, but is smaller and less powerful than Corsair, they struggle to punch in and put their own RGB tech or whatever out there, because they might only be able to afford R&D for, say, 2 devices, and Corsair's got 15.
Well, would Corsair come calling if Scythe, for example, were to say, hey, we've got a fan that is Corsair compatible? I mean, theoretically, that shouldn't be the case, but that's where in more formal documentation of more formal standards, I think, would come into play. It's like, okay, if we do assume that it's reasonable not to support the software for 10 years, which is maybe a stretch, then what do we need in order to solve the problem ourselves? And it's really just the documentation. Tell us how this works so that we don't accidentally create software that will erase the SPD, or put your power supply into 0 rail mode, where it's can go to a dead short, if that's even a thing you can possibly do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think this is where, in terms of a healthier industry, for not just allowing the computer hardware scene to keep growing and establishing itself, and ultimately you're fighting off things too, like game streaming or whatever the case may be, but also to benefit innovation, trying to open some of the sensor clusters up and the RGB cluster, but it's a different kind of cluster, that one.
Yeah. So as you were kind of describing the problem with RGB, it seemed to me that this is a problem that I'd encountered before, and that was with like Nuvoton controllers on motherboards. Like, how much documentation do we actually get? Nuvoton actually probably has much more intellectual property to protect then the intellectual property to protect, if it exists, around RGB headers and RGB controllers. But that's a chip on your motherboard that has a bunch of analog inputs, and it can read the 12-volt line and the 3.3-volt line and SVI 3, and motherboard makers can implement that in different ways. Asus does their own thing, like they have their own controller, and the documentation on these things is slim to non-existent. We've talked to people that have looked at licensing those kinds of things, or looked at getting that kind of thing working in their own software, and whenever we ask them about it, they say, well, it costs a lot to license. And it's like, license what? Why can't you read a bus address, you send a command, and you get a number back? Does that really rise to the level of intellectual property licensing?
It's
Come on.
like a toll booth.
Yeah. Yeah.
You transact across the bus and you pay $0.25 every time you do it.
Yeah, that's basically what we are. So the fix for that, like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. This kind of thing already happened with enterprise hardware. The modern NVMe drives that we enjoy today, a lot of the stuff in them came from another initiative called OpenCompute. And so that's when I was like, well, wait, why don't we just take the pattern from OpenCompute and how they're doing servers in the enterprise and apply that to the very, very table scraps thing that is RGB and RGB controllers.
And so you mentioned right before we started filming, you described RGB as the thin part of the wedge.
Yeah.
What is the thicker part of the wedge?
The thicker part of the thin end of the wedge for the thing that we should do for the benefit of consumers is to better document how the platform works, and issues of software longevity kind of go away, because if a bunch of people have the AX1600, then the software will probably be carried forward. But also there'll be innovation. People will do things with the software that the original companies never really considered, because it's like, hey, I want to do this, I want to solve this problem for myself, I've got the documentation to do it, it's not insurmountable, I'll do that.
And also, so this is where you get cool solutions like community driven,
Yeah.
where you might just have an enthusiast programmer
Yeah.
who wants to build something and commit it to GitHub or something.
So this whole thing with intellectual property as a blocker for doing your own thing, how do you crack that nut? It's like, well, the thin end of the wedge is, let's start with the RGB controller, because that is literally the dumbest thing. Like, is that the hill that Corsair really wants to die on? Is that the hill that Lee and Lee or other companies really want to die on?
I think Lee and Lee would be more open. I think I can talk to Jameson. I think Jameson may be open to it. Corsair, RGB seems like they are willing to die on that hill, but who knows? Yeah, so...
Well, it ultimately, okay, if you're Corsair and you look at this and this actually gets some traction, look at what a position you would be in if you become the industry standard. I mean, you give up the option to charge royalties to say Corsair compatible, but maybe you can say Corsair certified. Maybe you go through a certification process. I mean, NVIDIA did that with G-Sync. It's like, this is NVIDIA certified. Maybe that's the angle that Corsair could still make some money, but we that use the darn products can still benefit.
Might even make them more money if they have a certification process that doesn't get in the way of the openness of. So, and I think this is an important distinction to make as well, where with when you talk open source, I think the best counter argument to a lot of it is if you go to NVIDIA and you say, why isn't DLSS open source? I mean, it is now, but it wasn't their intent. It got kind of, it's out there. But
some more wedges.
Yeah, so like, why isn't DLSS open source? Why isn't whatever other software open source? The answer, and I think this is fair, especially for something like NVIDIA drivers, where they've really put a lot of money into it. The answer is, why would we help our competitors?
Yeah.
We spent the money to build this. We spent the time to build this. Why should we just give it away? I think that's a defensible position in some aspects. However, when you're talking RGB and all this other sensor clusters and everything, the question I have for you is, for anyone in the audience who might view it more in line with the examples I just gave of, well, but Corsair spent the money to build this. What's your response?
So, okay, let's look at the best case scenario for Corsair. You've got some really amazing RGB software, and it ties in with CSGO and Dota 2, and you can have your RGB lighting effects follow what's happening in the game. Corsair will have spent some money with the game studios to make that happen. Corsair will have spent the R&D stuff to do all that, but none of that innovation lives in hardware. None of that innovation is ultimately about controlling the ones and zeros. To make that argument, that no, our RGB controller or our RGB header has this kind of special sauce in it would be making the same argument about your monitor or the power cord for the computer.
The power cable's a good example, yeah. I think that, bring it back to the complaints, one of the issues I had with it is, in theory, all these companies really have to do is follow a pinout, because a lot of the stuff we saw at the show was they're transacting across the same or similar bus. They are using, they're sending power and they're sending data and maybe TAC. And those things are all the same anywhere.
Yeah, well, there is a software protocol aspect of it that may be different.
Okay.
But that is one of the best places to have a standard. Not wanting to share that standard would be like not wanting to share like the North American power standard. It's like, oh, it's 110 volts. But if you don't also know that that's a 60 hertz cycle, if it's 110 volts at 50 hertz, you're going to be in for a bad time.
Yeah, right. And so I think what I'd like to see, sort of finalizing the solution ideas here, for the solution, I think what I'd like to see is the companies move to at least a pinout that is compatible.
And probably a software definition.
Yeah, because if you want a height fan with the Corsair LED strip, because you bought one of them, and 3 years later Corsair doesn't make this fan anymore, but Height still makes their fan, at least you could put them together instead of end up with a pile of e-waste or just spend a ton of money.
How cool would it be if you had a fan that plugged into your motherboard that had a tiny, easily managed connector, but it was both RGB and fan control, and it was standardized across the industry?
That would be the actual solution. You know, like that would actually fix the problem.
Yeah, well, the magic words in the company context for what you're describing are royalty-free. It's like, here is a royalty-free specification for this. If Corsair thinks that they can design the best specification for that, all right, pony up, make it royalty-free so that anybody can implement it.
Yeah, and that's the other distinction too. Any of them would be willing to sell their solution. I mean, Corsair, I asked them, I was like, so how about standards? And I said, well, if anyone wants to license it from us, they can, which no one will do.
Yeah.
So what then, what's your idea? Where do we go from here?
So I think the solution is to create an open organization. I don't have a name for it because we literally just created it. I created a thread on the Level 1 forums that is, this is something that I hope we can incorporate as a non-profit, like the Open Compute project. I want to take the template of Open Compute, and the story of Open Compute is actually super interesting. Facebook is responsible for a positive force in the world. Even a broken clock's right twice a day. And it's the Open Compute project. And with the Open Compute project, you have basically a platform that companies that are building servers have to adhere to prevent exactly the same kind of thing, exactly what we're describing and thinking of, and it's like, oh, the AX1600 support has gone away. Those kinds of things are generally not an issue for the Open Compute project anymore, because the servers that they're ordering from large manufacturers have been converted into such a commodity and documented through the Open Compute initiative. It's no longer an issue. Network switches, they have their own operating system that follows that. And so in the enterprise, and big billion-dollar businesses have already solved this, and companies trying to make a few $100,000 to a few $1 million is basically just table scraps.
Right.
So let's just take the template where smart people have already figured it out, copy paste
Give it to dumb people.
to RGB, and we're done. And that's basically the plan.
Okay. So then, what specifically do we contribute? Like what do you do? What do I do here?
The most important thing here is audience participation.
Okay.
And so if the audience wants this, then these companies will be compelled to participate.
Right.
Companies will be compelled to pledge a royalty-free contribution to the nonprofit. It'll hopefully end up being incorporated as a nonprofit. And then really the nonprofit is just a repository of documentation and knowledge. So here's how you build an RGB interface for this. Here's how an AX1600i. It's unsupported. How much harm would there be in supplying the documentation that you don't even have to give us the source code for the software? We don't want that. Keep your crappy software that doesn't work anyway. But we would like documentation on how it works. What's the command set? What is that? And this website, this platform can be where that documentation lives. So if an open source developer wants to build a new interface for Steve's AX1600i, well, there's the documentation.
I think that also encourages, it starts to solve some of the problem I mentioned of smaller companies being constrained out of the market, because if they want to contribute to that, that becomes a marketing play for them as well. Where, okay, let's use Scythe as an example again. Scythe with infinitely less money and power than Corsair, or Cooler Master, even better example, says, we want to contribute, here's our idea for RGB whatever. And then maybe some other smaller company says, yeah, we'll use that and we'll contribute something too.
There's probably a lot of folks in the audience that are already kind of clued into this, or maybe even some of the executives in the companies looking at this saying, well, it's not really that simple. The easiest counterexample I can think of is like Nuvoton. It's like they don't really want to necessarily open up everything, and there is maybe an argument that is, if they opened exactly everything, somebody could clone their silicon because the specification has been fully provided. And somebody working backward from the specification to implement new hardware, that's maybe actually a protected activity.
And I will say, I do, as someone who also has to protect certain intellectual properties, I agree with the concept of protecting intellectual properties that are hard fought. So the end of your dialogue there on this example, I guess, Nuvoton has actually opened some of their stuff up? Okay.
Yeah, they provide some documentation for some of this, and sometimes the companies that use those components lean on, oh, well, they don't want to provide all the documentation, or we have an NDA for this type of thing, so we can't really open it up as much as we would like. But as those companies have come to work more with open source initiatives and other things that aren't RGB table scraps, they've generally been not burned, and so it's a different day today than it was a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago. The companies see the benefit. I think Nuvoton is starting to see the benefit of, okay, we can open this and we're not putting ourselves at too much of a risk of having our hard-fought IP stolen because we're providing documentation on how it works, whereas maybe historically that was something else. So I think that's exciting to see that a lot of companies are willing to do that. And I think if the customers are leaning on them to say, hey, we're gonna have to come up with our own thing, or lean on it. Or you have companies like Asus that go in the opposite direction, where they do their own silicon and the documentation is even worse. Hence why even Hardware Info 64 struggles with Asus's controller, which is frankly embarrassing in 2023.
Yeah, and also I think this, for a company like Asus, I could see the argument you're making, where if this is, say, the sensor cluster is semi-open or something, if good software is developed for that by a third party, it could actually create customers for the product because they want to use the third-party software. And then Asus doesn't even have development cost. So it still moves product without needing development time.
Like on Linux, there's the LM Sensors project, and there have been so many people hounding after developers that do what little bit of work happens with those sensor platforms, that some of the more successful GitHub projects have shut down just because of the flood of people bugging that one developer for sensors. We have a few threads on the Level 1 forums already where we kind of have unofficial patches that kind of get it working in some scenarios. But some of these motherboards will use like this version of this chip for like Rev 1.0 and 1.1, and then this version of this chip for another one. And so LM Sensors will work on this motherboard for that version, but not this one. Whereas if you use the motherboard vendor software, their software takes that into account. So you get these weird edge cases that are hard to support. But again, if we have an open, it's like, here is the documentation, the beacon of sanity among the insane, then maybe these kinds of problems go away.
So what final part here then is, what are the next steps?
We've got to incorporate a nonprofit, I think, and we've got to get at least a few companies on board to pledge a royalty-free license or implementation, knowledge, documentation for this kind of thing. A good olive branch would be documentation on how the AX1600i works.
Yeah, that's a good one, because it's an irrelevant product at this point.
And you know, while reverse engineering is a thing, that is a level of unnecessary human suffering, and I don't think it's ethical to ask people to endure. It's like, oh, reverse engineer this thing, reverse engineer the old software. It's like, so just install Windows XP and reverse engineer how the AX1600i worked on Windows XP, and it's just like, that's an unnecessary level of human suffering if somebody has the documentation on how this works.
So when we get back, when we leave Taipei, then get back,
We got to name it.
we can name it.
You got any ideas for names? That's how engagement challenge.
Oh no, I do like OpenPleb. Okay, so I can talk to my IP lawyer. You can talk to a lawyer. We can figure out what the plan is. I think
It's going to be linked below when we get it done.
Yeah, and I asked, and timeline, I don't know, like legal stuff takes a little while, but I asked Wendell, who understands open source and programming related things way more than I do. So what do I contribute to your idea?
Your anger.
Yeah, that was pretty much his answer. So I am stocked up on anger, rage, and companies that will listen to me if I bring that frustration to them at a show. So I think I can at least start talking to the companies, especially the ones where I have direct access to the CEOs.
And it is kind of exciting that we've got a couple of threads on the forum already where we can take the stuff that we've learned about some of these obscure voltage control hubs, platform hubs, not just Nuvoton, I'm picking on them, there's more than that. And that is, it's like, this isn't open, but this is what we've been able to clean room reverse engineer.
Right.
'Cause maybe that can be part of it too.
So that's the plan then.
That's the plan.
We'll see if it's called OpenPleb. I'll have to
Gotta come up with a better name.
we'll have to run a few checks on that.
I don't know. Maybe names will come once the jet lag subsides.
Maybe. So that is it for this one. That's our kind of talk about the problem morphed into, hey, maybe there's a solution here. And check out Level1 Techs with Wendell, and we'll link that below.
Thanks.
Wendell, thanks for joining.
No, thank you.
We'll see you all next time.